The moderator for the second panel is Charles Bolden. Charles, I'm not going to talk a lot about, but he is a very experienced astronaut and has flown a number of times as a commander, and has also, I think, had a great and distinguished career in the Marine Corps, in operational organizations within the Marine Corps and flying organizations. So he has a great background, and I think is well qualified to be our moderator this morning. So, Charlie.
Thank you, Mr. Abbey. In keeping with Dr. Alford's instructions, we're going to try to make the introductions very brief, but for the benefit of some people who may not know or may not have had an opportunity to interface with the panelists, I'm going to very quickly tell you who they are going down the line and what their experience was in terms of long-duration spaceflight, because I am the only one on this panel with no long-duration space experience. So I'm as anxious as all of you to hear from them. I am old. That's true. I can see this is going to be good. To my immediate right is the veteran of 5 space missions, including 163 days on the International Space Station. He's had 4 spacewalks. Colonel Jim Voss, who's of the United States Army, retired. To his right is Dr. Leroy Chow. Leroy is very well known to everybody here. He is somewhat unique in that he has active experience with the Russian, European, Japanese, and Chinese space programs. And when I say interaction with him, it's more than just having looked at a book like I have done. So hopefully he will give us some of his insights there. He is also a veteran of 4 space missions. He was a commander and NASA science officer on Expedition 10 aboard the International Space Station and has interesting perspectives about reentry and a lot of other great things. So Leroy Chow. Next to Leroy is Pavel Vinogradov, a veteran cosmonaut. Pavel is one of the things I asked him to do was tell me what they like. And some of his hobbies actually are studying the history of aviation. He's interested in cosmonautics and astronomy and game sports. He launched aboard Soyuz TMA-8 from Baikonur in 2006 and served on the International Space Station, where he also conducted 2 successful spacewalks there. So Pavel. Don Pettit. Dr. Don Pettit, the father of 2 energetic boys who are now in kindergarten, and he may want to talk a little bit about that and the value of going to space when they're as young as they were at the time. Don is a veteran of Expedition 6, where he left Mickey and the 2 boys here, twins, as a matter of fact. His wife, Mickey, is an accomplished vocalist and is a delight in and of herself. So we could have her to talk about long-duration spaceflight. And last but not least, a very good and old friend, not in age but in years, is Dr. Joe Kerwin. Joe is a flight surgeon and naval aviator. He was a pilot on the first Skylab mission in 1973, where he spent a month and was sort of the beginning of the U.S. long-duration space program. Joe was one of the developers of the SAFER, the portable propulsion piece of gear that we now use on the International Space Station and the like, and that's our board. I want to go back to one thing that Franklin mentioned as a result of someone else mentioning it. In fact, it was Dr. Levy, and that's about getting this living cell, from one pinhead to the other. Hopefully that will be the theme of these next 3 days, because as Dr. Alford, I think, would tell you if you asked him, back in the formative days of the National Space Biomedical Research Institute, the challenge was, how do we get a cell to distant places in the universe and then back safely in one piece? Simply put, that's been the work about which NSBRI has been, I think, for a long time, and hopefully will help us to do that. So in case anybody was wondering, that's the reason we assembled all of you, and if we're successful, we'll be a little bit better down the road to getting that little cell back from whatever pinhead it settles on the last time. I'm going to ask each of the panel members to give you bullets about the topics that they would like to see this body discuss over the next 3 days before we actually ask them specific questions and ask them to amplify their thoughts on these. So starting with Jim, I think you've got some ideas.
Well, earlier during the previous panel, there was a really great question, I believe from a gentleman from MIT, I'm not sure who it was, but it was about how we prepare for going to Mars. I don't think we really answered it with a medical perspective, and I think there are a lot of medical challenges for long-duration spaceflight. I saw some of those things before selection, while training, during flight, and post-flight. And I think there are 5 different areas that have to be considered by the medical community in general to prepare us for long-duration flight. The first is astronaut selection, making sure we get the right people who are fit, both physically, whatever fit really means, and that's something that has to be determined and discussed before we select people. And then when we put them on crews, you've got to decide medically if they're going to fit together in all the ways that they have to fit. The other is in-flight medical care. We know that there are challenges associated with that. There's a lot of work that's done on the toolbox that we take with us to do medical procedures, the preparation of crews, and the selection of the people that we're going to take, deciding who's going to go. I would think if I were going to be ill or sick or hurt on a flight to Mars, I would want all my crew members to be doctors of a variety of different sorts. It may or may not be practical, but we've got to have medical support. If you get hurt that far away from home, you've got to have a way to do it. And I did hear, I think Jean-Marc said that telemedicine was out of the question. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I'd always hoped that that might help us and allow us to work, but I know that with the delays in communication that could be a problem, but it certainly has to be addressed. There are 2 aspects of in-flight medical care that I don't think are typically discussed quite enough from my perspective anyway. One is the reluctance of crews to report when they have medical problems. I've seen that happen myself personally, and I think that it's something that has to be addressed. You've got to resolve that as an issue before people go on long flights. And the other is the psychological support that you need. That I know that a lot of people, in particular my Russian friends, have thought a great deal about the psychological support that's necessary, and the United States has learned more about it over time from you. I didn't realize how important it was, how critical it is to the success of a crew and their overall well-being to have the proper psychological support while you're on a long-duration flight, and it must be considered. The third area is countermeasures. We got to take care of those things, and radiation, I think, is the #1 area that we are not well prepared for right now. The others, I think, we have addressed somewhat, but radiation is the thing that I worry most about on a long flight outside of the Van Allen radiation belts in the Earth's atmosphere. And psychological countermeasures as well. Medical contingencies plans is another area that has to be addressed and is being addressed. Saw something recently on that, and I know that everyone is thinking about those things, but we have to have concrete plans, and we've got to have the right forums to agree on the type of things that we're going to do so that we can return if we need to, or take care of a disabled crew member or death on a long flight. We have to have all those plans in place. And finally, we've got to have something to take care of the after effects of a flight. When you arrive at a destination after months of a trip, whether it's 1 month or 5 months, you still have to address what does a person have to do to be able to function completely. Is there rehabilitation necessary at the destination? And then, of course, after the flight, when you return to the Earth, there is rehabilitation that has to be taken care of here, and consideration of the long-term medical effects and care for crew members that we sent out on those type of a mission. So those are the 5 things that I think that the medical community have to address, and not just talk about, but have the discussion on to resolve and fix. Thank you.
Roy?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I'd like to say it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'd like to thank Dr. Alford and Mr. Abbey and Charlie and all of you for having me today. You know, my message to you may seem painfully obvious, but there's a lot of subtleties. There are a lot of subtleties involved, and I'll give you a couple of examples, but it's something I think needs to be brought up now and then to be thought about. And that is, there's a huge difference between long-duration flight and short-duration flight. Now, I have to confess that after my 3rd shuttle mission, I had accumulated a whopping 36 days in space. I had done 4 spacewalks, helped build the space station, and all that cool stuff. And secretly inside, I knew that I could extrapolate my experience and tell you what long-duration space flight was like, and what was important and what wasn't important. And of course, it wasn't until I trained and flew Expedition 10, which was a 6.5-month flight, that I knew how wrong I was. Now, why is this important? It's important because I have to point out that at NASA's senior management, both at headquarters, JSC, and the other field centers, the people in the senior management levels who are astronauts and operators, with the exception of my good friend Carl Waltz, with whom I flew on STS-65, they're all short-duration shuttle flyers. Okay, and so they're going to believe, just as I did, that they can tell you what's important on a long-duration flight. Okay, and I'd like to give you just a couple of quick examples before I pass the baton, and they're pretty subtle, and maybe they're important, maybe they're not, but it helps illustrate my point. And that is, first of all, we all know that when you go into space, in the short term, you get a big fluid shift. You know, you see all the photographs. Everyone's got big puffy faces, and you know, on a long-duration flight, as the mission progresses, you see the photographs come back, and gradually everybody's face kind of goes back to normal. It seems to be around a month or so when your body starts equilibrating. Or I should say everybody's face goes back to normal except for mine, because it's naturally kind of round. But similarly, there are things that you don't expect, and one of them was food. Okay, I mean, everybody, and kudos to the folks who work on space food. I know they're always trying to give us more variety and more tasty alternatives. But, you know, you taste the space food, and every astronaut and cosmonaut asks himself, can I really eat this for 6 months? You know, am I going to have to force myself to eat to keep my weight up, to keep my health going? And something interesting happens. Every short-duration flyer will tell you, yeah, the food's pretty, you know, we're busy, and we don't have an appetite, so we lose weight. Every astronaut loses weight on shuttle flights. And, you know, so that becomes a concern for you guys. You know, well, what do we need to do to keep astronauts healthy? But what I found, and I think several of my colleagues I've talked to have the same experience, that after a few weeks, your mind plays a trick on you. Suddenly this food becomes really delicious. I think your mind knows that it needs to eat to stay healthy. And so suddenly it's great. You look forward to it, and just like on the ground, you've got to be careful you don't overeat because you don't want to gain a bunch of weight. The second example I want to talk about is input to the vehicle design. Now, I've heard, I know of at least one instance where a senior shuttle astronaut gave official input that said, we don't need a table. We don't understand why the Russians always design a table into their spacecraft and their stations. It's a huge waste of space, volume, you know, mass, and all that. Why do we need a table? Well, I'll tell you, on a shuttle mission, of course, there's no table. And you can just sit around and you eat out of your little packs and you talk and you have a good time. So why do you need a table? There's something almost intangible that just hits a very comfort vibe of a crew gathering around a table and having a meal. And it may not sound like a big deal, but after several months in space, it becomes a big deal. And as we go longer and longer, both in low Earth orbit as well as journeying on to the moon and maybe to Mars in a few years, it's going to become even more important. So little subtleties like that are what I'd like for everyone to think about. And make sure you engage long-duration crew members and talk about our experiences to get our perspective.
Fantastic. Thank you. Pavel.
Прежде всего, хочу сказать
First and foremost,
спасибо за вот эту встречу,
I would like to thank everybody for this meeting, because indeed our space programs and the efforts of our specialists, the specialists from all the countries, brought us truly unique results. And at this time, I think that there is not a single project in the world that would consolidate and bring together so strongly specialists from different countries. And I believe that that's the most important achievement of all our activities in space. I believe that that is true for the ISS, and that, of course, was true for the Mir NASA program. And today I wanted to share some issues, some questions that I'm sure are a concern for everybody at this table and around, because we have all been to space for quite some time, and I believe that we have all arrived at the same thought that 40 years ago, our flights probably could be evaluated like a sprint run, a short and intense run, and now we are more like marathon runners. We run for a long time, and for the future of flights such as Moon and Mars is going to be a mega marathon, a long and heavy one, and those tasks should be evaluated bearing this in mind.
проблема и вопросы обеспечения
the
вообще
problems
безопасности и
and
медицинской, в
issues
частности,
of
наверное, в этих
ensuring
полетах
safety, including medical safety during those flights, I
Мы
believe
сегодня,
would
в общем-то,
take the key
понимаем, как решать
priority.
технические
We
проблемы.
understand these days how to resolve technical issues, and the questions that we are looking at today from the standpoint of insufficient technical support may not be so scary for us because we basically know the overall pathways to resolving these issues, but the things that are related to medicine, psychology, crew selection and assignment are indeed quite significant issues, and already today we need to start working on resolving them. I disagree with the statement that we need to have a stricter criteria for medical selection. As our doctors say, there are no absolutely healthy people on a planet. There are people who have not been tested enough.
Конечно, нужно искать совершенно новые пути, новые подходы и к формированию экипажа, к отбору людей, которые
selecting the people who are going to be flying into deep space. Another point is that if something happens in orbit today, we can bring the crew back within several hours, and this time reserve of several hours is, of course, taken into account by our specialists or medical specialists, and if we're talking about flights to the moon, this would increase to several days, 5, 6, 10 days. And while we're talking about Mars, it is the possible emergency return time will increase to several months. And that should be the premise on which we base all the work aimed at supporting the crews during flight. And I fully agree with my colleagues here that certainly we need to make sure that from the technical standpoint the vehicles will have to be different. They would be designed not only for work like it is done now on board the station, but maybe even to a greater extent they need to be designed for the crew living there, for their life during flight. And that's quite a different approach, and that makes it all look in a completely different light. These days, our stations and vehicles are providing the crew transportation, and it's quite minimal as to what they provide in terms of crew life. You know, we do sleep, we do eat, we do our physical exercise. However, one has to admit that it's not taken as the main priority in our design and development. The engineers treat us as one of the systems of those vehicles, like one of the systems on board the station. Maybe it sounds like something to take offense at, but it's actually true. All the vehicles that were sent into flight in the beginning were designed for one specific mission goal, and then the crew was sort of added on, and the crew was there to counteract some possible failures on the part of engineers. If you couldn't do that in the hardware, you had to do that with the wetware. And so that's the most important thing. It's a different ideology. It's a completely different ideology for building our space systems.
And I always tell our colleagues, engineers, that when we learn to design a space vehicle like a Mercedes, those are really luxurious, very comfortable, ergonomic vehicles. Only then we'll be able to fly further on those wonderful space vehicles.
As Pavel was saying, long-duration flight is like doing a marathon. And like a marathon, you can't train for a marathon by running marathons. You have to do something short of a marathon to train for a marathon. You actually use analog training to get ready for a marathon. And spaceflight, long-duration spaceflight is no different than that. Because of the infrequent nature of flying a mission, because of the cost and the potential for catastrophe, we need to train crews using analogs in a mix that will prepare them for their space flight. And this includes things that do both skill sets and what I like to refer to as a mind set, where you do training where you have to live with real consequences for your actions, and you don't necessarily get that in a simulator. And you also have to have what I like to call a professional explorer's attitude, where you become very conservative so that you can maintain the mission goals, you can bring the assets back okay, and the crew can come back okay. And when you're on a frontier, you almost have to operate in this conservative manner so that you can get your mission done. Analogs in are something that you can do frequently at a low cost relative to your mission. And in training crews like this, you can minimize crew mistakes. And maybe more important, you can overcome unforeseen problems with hardware and the operations through the skill sets that the crew picks up so that you can be successful in your mission.
Thank you. Dr. Kerwin.
I knew there'd be a lot of overlap between the goals and thoughts that we had, and there is. Medical care is right up there in front. My thought on that is that no matter when we fly into deep space, we will be dissatisfied with the state of the art and with our knowledge of the effects of weightlessness and our ability to provide the same care in the spacecraft that we get at Baylor College of Medicine. Can't be done. So it's going to be very important for everybody to agree on the level of risk inherent in flying that particular mission with that particular medical care capability, and sign up to it, and then go. Example: if I were offered today to fly on a 2-year Mars mission, and I knew that I'd accumulate a lifetime dose of radiation, some of which is poorly understood, would I go? Sure, I would. However, I would also like to have that risk reduced. So medical care is important. Acknowledging the risks will have a major role in affecting crew selection in order to minimize the risks of flying people with diseases we can't treat. But there's that whole other layer of importance to crew selection, crew training, and that is crew compatibility. When I go, I want to be on a crew that's well-led, that is compatible, that shares goals, and shares understanding of the rules of governance of what is going to be an independent country until it gets back to Earth, because nobody but us can govern that spacecraft and its missions. Can that be done with an international crew? Yes, it can. But the farther away management gets from the front line, the more difficult it is for them to understand the importance of that and not to compromise it. It's an interesting issue. Research. There's a lot, as has been said, that we don't know about the physiology of weightlessness. I hope that our lunar missions, that our lunar program will be seen as an excellent opportunity to perform research, including some basic research, always including some basic research, I hope, on the effects of 1/6 gravity. Is 1/6 gravity similar to microgravity in its effect on us, or does it represent a countermeasure in itself? Very important to know that and characterize it before we go on. Getting back to crew makeup, I concur with Scott's comment that a mixture of cooperation and competition is going to be important in achieving the best results in it, and it's a very interesting field for us to discuss and get our arms around. That's it.
We have very little time, so we're going to change from what the plan was, and that's open the floor to questions at this time. If you do have a question, just raise your hand. Someone will bring you a mic, and that's for the benefit of people in the booth plus benefit of all of you. In the meantime, while we're looking for hands to go up, oh boy, who's running the mic there? Let me ask one question. That's psychological. Each of you has talked about psychological factors and stressors. If you were king for a day, and Leroy, let me start with you since this was one of your principal questions. What would you do in crafting training or preparation for a crew to be able to better deal with the psychological stressors that you think are going to come from 6 months to a year in space?
Well, Charlie, thanks. That's a great question, and I've thought about this question before, and I'm trying to remember. Trying to think back. Well, how did I prepare myself for this long duration flight? And I really didn't come up with any solid answers because I think it was just a matter of thinking about it and getting used to it. And when I started the program, I thought, oh my goodness, well, all American astronauts do or did at the time because we thought, well, gee, it's going to be years before I fly. I've got to be a backup first, and I've got to go train to be a prime. So, but that time has a purpose. Over those 3.5 years that I trained, I got very used to the idea of flying for 6.5 months. I talked to a lot of people who had flown those duration flights, and I don't know, maybe the answer is using analogs like Don has suggested. I've never been on an analog, but yet I felt very well prepared for my long duration flight. So I'm afraid I don't have a real tangible answer. It's just a matter of thinking about it, getting comfortable with it personally, and getting data from other people who've done it, and then assimilating all that.
Okay. Don?
I'd like to add that if you are training in preparation of a long-duration space flight, again, you don't train for a marathon by running marathons. You do something short of a marathon. 28 to 30 days for an analog training seems to be a critical number where you start off and you can't see the end from the beginning. Well, there's a variety of opinions, but 28 to 30 days, let me put it this way. I can't see the end from the beginning for a 28 to 30 day mission. So doing something of that order, I believe, gives you a pretty good idea of how you're going to behave on a longer mission.
Question up here. And just so you don't think I've lost control, we have been given about 10 more minutes by Dr. Jeff Davis, who has the next panel. So we're going to run over a little bit, but not too much.
My question has to do with psych support, and more specifically family support. There was really little mention of it. Is it important? Are we doing enough? And if not, what else should we do when it comes to family support?
Anybody?
Well, I believe it is essential, and it is very important. Not just family, friends, a variety of other things. And I think that our experience from the Russian experience from their space stations in the Mir and from the International Space Station, we're doing it fairly well now. We started out on Expedition 2 with having only weekly telecons with our families, and we didn't have video teleconferencing that worked very well. Later we got a telephone that you could actually call friends and family almost daily, and it made a huge difference in our well-being, I think, psychologically. To me, that was a key element that made life much more tolerable for a long time, just being away from home, no matter where you are.
I see you shaking your head.
I absolutely agree with Jim. Absolutely, because it's a significant issue, and we need to discuss this issue of family support. Support of your family, of the astronaut and the cosmonaut, is purely a support of a crew member. Believe me, you start working differently, and the dynamic is different within the crew, because I always wanted to find out what's happening in the family of my crewmate on orbit, and it brings you together. If you talk about things that are important for you and family, is of paramount importance to all of us. Therefore, the family support becomes of primary significance, and when you know that your family, your loved ones, your friends, and your children, your wife are taken care of on the ground, you know that the organization that sent you takes care of them. You work differently on orbit. You have a relief of some sort, and it's really valuable.
Okay. Before I go to the next question, I would offer an analog to the issue of family support, being a 34-year veteran of the Marine Corps. We, and all military folk, are looking at ways to make sure that the family is taken care of. A soldier, a sailor, an airman, a Marine does a much better job when they go off into combat if they're not worried about their families. We have learned those lessons over and over and over, and today we expend a lot of money and effort in trying to find ways to take care of the family. And one of the things that we might do as a community, as a space community, is check with military practitioners and find out what it is they do, what kind of lessons they've learned, because I consider, although I've never flown what's considered a long-duration space mission, when my family was okay and I felt comfortable about that, I could focus on the mission. And that's exactly the way it was any time that I deployed as a military person. So I think it's critical. Question there.
Leroy mentioned the current space food was tasty enough after long duration. Do you agree? Other astronaut, I want to ask this question.
Yeah, the food is really yummy. It's one of these things that it's like eating camping food. If you took a thing of freeze-dried and ate it for dinner here at home, it might not taste so good. But if you're out on a camping trip and you've spent all day digging a snow shelter or something and you're really, really hungry, that food tastes outstanding. So hunger is a really good spice. And the food on space tastes really good.
But they keep working on it, don't they? Don't stop there.
And variety is also very good. Having half U.S. food we're comfortable with and half Russian food, which was different for us, was excellent. Yeah. And it made a difference. There were times when I could not stand any more of the things that I thought I liked, and I really liked having the variety. So variety is good with food.
A question I would ask, no answer required, based on Jim's comment just now. We have grown accustomed to a binary program, Russia and the U.S. When we talk about truly international programs, are there provisions for integrating other, cuisine? That's a question. I see Mary shake. I see people shaking their heads, so I assume it is, and that's a good.
Are we going to have French cuisine?
Yeah. Okay. Question.
I'm Peter Kavanagh from the Cleveland Clinic. I want to ask a question about crew selection. I heard Francis Collins, the director of the Human Genome Project, say that within the decade we're going to have a $1,000 genome. So getting your genome done will be like having an MRI. So how does the crew crew members feel about their genetic susceptibilities being used as a determination of acceptability for long-term spaceflight?
Dr. Kerwin, you want to start with that?
Oh boy!
Since you can spell genome,
I can spell genome. I don't understand the science, but I understand the question, and the problem is that if you pile too many requirements that have to be met before an individual can be selected to a crew, you may be weeding out a lot of good people. I would certainly accept the genomic sequence as a possible selection mechanism if you were pretty certain that it was valid, and if the illness or injury if the condition that you were ruling out was significant on the mission. But I'd be hesitant to get too enthusiastic about it because we have a lot of other things to consider in putting that crew together.
Question.
I just follow up on that. This issue of genomics and genetics always goes to selection. It's not a selection issue. It's a countermeasure. It's a differential vulnerability countermeasure optimization issue. It's if we know you are more vulnerable genetically to something, then we try to deliver countermeasures prophylactically to prevent you. In other words, you take your countermeasures earlier than the other crew or more of them. And we got to get this thing away just from selection. I know it can go there, and that always leads to that, I don't think we ought to do that. But that's a mistake. That's not using the best science we have on Earth to make sure we succeed in these missions. And this has to be tied to countermeasures. That's what I would argue.
Okay. Question here. Next to Ellen. There you go.
Thanks, Christian Otto from Ottawa, Canada. Just wanted to make a couple of comments. Don, I'll have to respectfully disagree with you on the 30 days in terms of proper preparation for long-duration spaceflight. And heard some of my comments on our data from South Pole. And we often see this, that how individuals function at 6 months versus 1 year, and it's completely different. And when we look at a potential Mars 30-month mission, and we consider that ISS is right now running at 6 months, that's a mission that's 5 times the length, or 6 times the length. So And when we see our individuals at South Pole and our other Antarctic stations, how they perform at 6 months versus a year, there's a significant difference. And I think that, you know, our Russian colleagues have a good sense for this because of their experience in long-duration flight. And I really have to comment and commend Pavel on his comments on family support, because we find that that's a big issue for our crews, and it contributes, is one of the many contributors to the cognitive decline that we see in individuals over a year-long deployment. So it's really, really critical to have those supportive measures, particularly family support. And that's one of the things we try and foster, and it's a countermeasure. We're not doing a great job, and I think it's an area that needs to be addressed further.
A question for the crew, a mic right here, and then while I'm asking this question, Jim talked about it, several people talked about honesty with the medical people on the ground, about crew condition. What can we do, or what needs to be done to foster a sense of trust, if you will, between the astronaut or the space flyer, whether it be an astronaut or not, and medical personnel who are back home, wherever it is? Anybody have a comment or a guess?
Couple quick comments, Charlie. First, I think the atmosphere of cooperation today is about as good as ever, and there's always going to be, you know, some temptation for someone who is in line for a flight to not spill all his guts to his doctor. I think in flight it's going to be the opposite. I don't think we're going to have a problem, and I do believe that telemedicine will play a significant role in treating people on the way to Mars.
Go.
Yeah, I think absolutely critical is the astronaut or cosmonaut's personal relationship with the flight surgeon. I mean, if you trust that individual, then you can tell that person everything, and you can weigh together the right response, and, you know, who else needs to know about this. But that means that the medical management, the management has to give the flight surgeons that freedom to be able to interact with the crew, and to be able to, you know, almost have kind of a attorney-client privilege, or, you know, secrecy, you know, that you can discuss anything with your physician without fear that he's going to be obligated to report every little thing, and it's going to be looked at by the International Commission, and every little problem that you bring up, which may be nothing, could get blown out of proportion, and who knows? You look hard enough, you're going to find something.
It's like somebody said earlier, one of our Russian colleagues, that, you know, there are no perfectly healthy specimen. There are just those that haven't been sufficiently tested. So I think that's what you're saying. Question back there.
There's evidence today that suggests that the individuals that are physically fit have a greater degree of longevity. That is from the medical profession. So my question is, do you think it's appropriate to use exercise as part of a preventive medicine scheme, so the more you prevent to maintain normal homeostasis, the better off you are in completing your end-to-end mission?
Aha.
Pre-flight or in-flight?
Pre and in flight, end-to-end.
I think that's part of the astronaut culture and has been forever.
We hear in the science community a different version. Some people think that exercise is not necessary.
Neil Armstrong, for example. Huh?
I would like to answer this question, if I may. Maybe I'll look at it from a different perspective. That is true. Physical exercises, especially on orbit, are of extreme importance. And a person who is involved in any physical exercises on the ground would know that you feel much better. Especially at the beginning, it was a bit problematic for me at the beginning of the mission, because you get hooked on physical exercise, and if you miss your physical exercise session, then you feel sluggish in the morning, you don't feel as happy. So for me, it was extremely important. My body was asking for physical exercise. I also looked at the physical exercise not only as health maintenance, but for me, it was also a psychological support. This physical exercise session would enable me to offload my stress. I knew that our schedules were extremely busy, and I think it's true for all the expeditions. We never have a chance to sit down and be bored on the space station, and therefore the physical exercise is a welcome break. It's your body feels being exercised, you feel that you're taken care of, and therefore physical exercise is not just physical aspect of your training, but psychological support. And food, maybe in 1, 2, or 3 or 4 weeks you get tired and sick of this food. But the main component, you have a good selection. So if you don't feel like eating this food, you have a choice. And psychologically, it's very important that you're not forced to eat one type of food, but a different. Maybe it's not the best gourmet food in the world, the one you eat on the space station. But by having a choice, by having a selection, you have a freedom, and psychologically you feel much better. And the same is true for physical exercise. We have a variety of exercise protocols. I have a choice, and this is very important for me.
Question.
Yeah, I'm Marcelo Vázquez from MSVRI, Space Radiation Liaison. My question to the panel is, how was your perception of the radiation risk in each of your flights, and how you were prepared before the flight to deal with those radiation risks in terms of shielding information, but also psychological, how you prepare psychologically to deal with the radiation issue?
Well, I think we were told what the radiation expected exposure was and what the risk was, and then I think I personally just disregarded it because there was nothing I could do about it. We did try to improve the radiation protection on board the station, both with local things we did with water and then with things that were sent up later on. But it's one of those things that I felt we had control over, so we just had to accept the risk.
Yeah, we had a couple of solar events during my long flight, and we were told well in advance, hey, during these times, go retreat to the more heavily shielded areas of the station. And like Jim said, though, what do you do after that? There's not much you can do about it. So I mean, you knew this was a possibility, and all you can do is ask how bad the dose was afterwards, and kind of think about it and put it away. Of course, it did make me think during those times while I did retreat into the test. Boy, what if we were on a mission to Mars? What would our exposure be? So, but as far as preparation, I don't know what you do except you know what the risk is and you accept it and you know it could happen.
Let me speak to the Apollo program a bit because we're going back to spend extended stays on the lunar surface, and the risk is very real there. The normal expectation is very little radiation. However, if you're stuck out on the surface EVA during a solar particle event, you could be in serious trouble. And there were a series of ground rules about returning to the LEM, launching, getting in the command module, pointing it skinny in toward the moon, doing everything you could to reduce that radiation to a level that would not create acute radiation sickness. And we're going to have a similar set of guidelines and equipment on the moon.
We're going to take 2 more questions, one here and then one right here, and unfortunately that'll close us out. So,
John Parrish from CIMMIT in Boston. What is the status of continuous physiologic monitoring? I especially ask for, is there information you wish you had that you don't? Because in one end of the spectrum you drowned in information with continuous physiologic monitoring, but are there things that you wish you could monitor that you can't?
Anybody? Well, you're talking to the crew, and we are the enemies of continuous physiological monitoring.
I'll ask that question again later.
Okay.
I want monitoring of things that will help me to remain healthy. Yeah. I think I don't think I need continuous all day every day. I think I can monitor myself some, but periodic evaluations and things like that I welcome because I want to make sure that I remain healthy in space.
However, agreeing with that, giving you docs the medical data you need to do valid experiments and arrive at conclusions is part of our job. And we're certainly enthusiastic about doing that.
And I volunteer Jim Voss for the continuous blood draw.
I never turned down an experiment.
No, but you've got to be careful because, if you monitor, unconsciously or consciously maybe, we are on if we know the cameras are on. If we know that we're being monitored, you're going to affect our behavior and you're going to affect our stress level. So, some of these ideas, we're going to have passive monitoring, you're not even going to know it's there. Well, we're going to know it's there. So think about it.
Question here. And this will be the last question, unfortunately.
Борис Юдин, Москва, Россия.
Moscow, Boris Yushin from Moscow, Russia. We were talking about the genetic tests as a selection criterion. Let's think from a different angle. If we are using some genetic modification technologies, what about changing the human in such a way that this human will be superior for exploration? Did you think about that? And what is your opinion? I'm very negative in any genetic modification. I like myself the way I am. I don't want to be modified. Thank you.
I know you could make me better, and I would welcome that if you could do it.
I think we're volunteering Jim for all these things.
Okay. Let me express on behalf of my fellow crew members here our appreciation for your questions and your interest. What we hope to do is inspire in you curiosity so that the rest of the weekend you'll continue to mull over these things that have been said here. I heard quite a few things that were very new to me. And I hope what you all heard were things that you perhaps had not thought about and you'll give more consideration to if we're to enable this cell to get from here to some other pinhead and back safely and alive. And I will leave you with a quote from Dr. Joe Kerwin that he submitted when I asked each of them to give me things that they were concerned about, and I love this. And this is a quote. He says, "Each crew member will bring baggage along, culture, beliefs, attitudes, experiences, virtues, and prejudices. The resulting stew must be made very carefully without regard to politics." With that, I leave you. Thank you very much.
Well, we're going to go ahead and get started on our third panel of the day. And certainly we've had two very good ones so far, and I have every expectation this one will be a good one as well. Our moderator for this panel is Dr. Jeff Davis, and Jeff is the head of life sciences at the Johnson Space Center. He had quite an involvement with the space program early on, and then also was down at UTMB, and we're fortunate to have him back with NASA, heading up the life science program. So I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. And I know we're running a little bit short on time, so the process we had for this panel will just jump right into questions and also hopefully take questions from you. We'll keep the introductions brief as well. Some of the folks you've met already. To my right is Dr. John Clark, who is a Navy and NASA flight surgeon now with the NSBRI. Next to him is Dr. Valery Bogomolov. Next is Peggy Whitson, who is a long-duration astronaut who has flown on ISS and will bring those perspectives for us. Next is Dr. Soichi Tachibana that you've met. And finally, Dr. Nick Canis from UCSF. I think this is just a very interesting time for us with spaceflight. We have Dr. Mel Antonano here with us from the FAA in terms of our relationships with commercial spaceflight. We continue with long-duration flight, and even on ISS, we've had tourist flights. Dr. Richard Jennings here, who has supported the spaceflight participants, and most recently, Mr. Charles Simoni. And just of note, I think you were talking about medical standards earlier. We have a Med Volume C that is for spaceflight participants, and we've been discussing with our international partners whether or not we could release that for the benefit of commercial spaceflight. And we'll be finalizing those discussions next week. But I think that's a very nice step forward where we could actually take a product from the government and make it available in the commercial world to further commercial spaceflight development. So we're very hopeful about that. And from the morning panels, I'm also very happy that Jim Voss is going to head up our new continuous physiological monitoring working group. So we'll have that first meeting next week, Jim, if you can make that. At any rate, we really appreciate the opportunity today. The previous panels have touched on a number of the questions I'd already written out, so I've been changing the criteria as we've been going along, and maybe amplify some of the questions and comments you had. And so I'd like to pose some questions initially right off the bat to the panel members and then open it up to the audience, and we'll go from there. So the first question I have, and I'd like each panel member to address, is given a 3-year round trip to Mars, what are your top 1 or 2 concerns? Can we adequately address those concerns? These are medical events that might occur in flight. Or if unsuccessful, what additional risk might we be incurring? So let me just start with Dr. Clark.
That's a tough one. We haven't ever done that, even on ground analogs, and I think we need to get some experience with that. The real concerns to me are behavioral health and performance in radiation. And we, again, are dealing with a very unknown area, especially with the radiation. The main thing, too, is to focus on mission success and not just crew health. I think there are enough instances where even minor problems have resulted in effects on mission success. So whatever we do has got to have that as our top focus.
When we are looking into such a long-duration project as a manned expedition to Mars, we proceed from our understandings as of today and the events that already occurred during manned spaceflight. We already talked about the differences of principle between the orbital flight and a flight to Mars. Those differences of principle, first and foremost, are such that the support from the ground and return of the crew in case of emergency are basically impossible if the expedition has already started. Of course, to a significant extent, we're looking into autonomous flight, a new vision of the radiation safety and radiation protection problem and ensuring performance, etc. And also it brings about a number of new objectives. After long-duration spaceflight, all the drawbacks of medical support and circumstances that had to do with a person perhaps not being able to feel quite well at the landing site. We have doctors and we can take good care of those people, but on the surface of Mars, that person would have to take care of himself, and so he has to have sufficient health margin, you can say, in order to perform all the necessary tasks per his flight program. In other words, we need to train those people to work on Mars. We also need to make sure that they're prepared to come back to Earth, and that would also have to be a self-care task. When we are talking about such major projects and when we evaluate the risks, first and foremost, I believe we should be thinking about the reliability of our means of technical support for this flight. From the standpoint of medicine, this translates into redundancy and reliability of the medical and biological support systems, such as life support systems of the station, the systems that control and ensure proper gas environment, proper atmosphere, proper food, countermeasures program, ensuring psychological support, and a number of other issues, a whole host of other issues. I would like to remind you that the Russian history of spaceflight has seen cases when flights had to be terminated early in view of either illness or some functional deficiencies or conditions that could not be evaluated from the ground. And so this is one of the criteria for terminating the flight. And as for the means of providing medical aid on board during the expedition to Mars, would have to be more perfect, more reliable, and ensure proper care in case of the broadest range of possible illnesses. And finally, when we are planning such complex work and tasks, we cannot really rely on the mission going nominally and smoothly. That is, we need to make sure that we have in our program the algorithms and means and methods for counteracting some difficulties or off-nominal situations that we might face. That part is extremely important as well, and so while at the ISS, if something breaks down, we can send it up with the next vehicle. Then during the flight to Mars, that capability will be taken away from us. I could talk a long time, but I think that I ran out of that same time. So
I think I would like to just reiterate some of what both Dr. Clark and Dr. Bogomolov commented on. I think radiation is probably one of the big points that I would be concerned about, and how we are going to adequately protect crews there and back. Obviously, getting there faster is probably the best protection we can give them. And I think that the psychological issues can be very serious in the long run. But the one that I've actually got the most experience with, that I think Dr. Bogomolov is talking about, is that we have to have very reliable hardware for exercise and for our life support. And we've got to have hardware that's reliable in a way that we can repair it, and we can repair it with the supplies that we can carry with us, which is extremely limited. So those things are going to be what keeps the people happy, is having the exercise hardware and not having to worry about your life support system. Those things will contribute a lot to our ability to go there and keep the crew in a good condition. So
I repeat, radiation is the biggest problem, I think, and microgravity effect and psychology, stress.
If I can speak to mainly the behavioral health issues, which is my area of interest, I think there's three issues I'd be worried about. One is a clinical one. and that's the effects of a mission like this on a crew and how to deal with an event. 5% of people going to the Antarctic will have some kind of psychiatric problem. It's rare, but what do you do with an astronaut who is suicidal? What do you do with a person who has ascendization to the point where you can't control it from the ground? How do you cope with this sort of event, a medical emergency in the psychiatric area on a trip to Mars? It could happen. If it does happen, it's rare. It could be catastrophic. The second two are evidence-based. In our research on Mir and the International Space Station, we did not find evidence of a third quarter phenomenon. I might as well hit you with all the controversial topics right away in the field. This is a phenomenon that has been reported after the halfway point where crews in the Antarctic suddenly have decrements. They have problems with depression. Did we find it in individual subjects? Yes. Did we find it overall when you apply strict statistics to the crews we studied in general? No. Why didn't we find it? We think it's because all the missions we studied have been on-orbit missions with tons of support from the ground, with a lot of monitoring. And I think the supportive network has been wonderful in preventing this. Going to Mars, where you have a 44-minute round-trip communication block and delays, it's hard to talk to your family in real time. The traditional supportive mechanisms aren't going to be working in Mars. Might we see third quarter phenomenon or decrements over the course of a 2.5-year mission? We could. We need to study this. Finally, I think we need to look at positive effects. We did a questionnaire study of 39 astronauts and cosmonauts about what are the positive effects of being in space. Every one of them reported positive changes as a result of being in space, and the single most important of 9 factors we looked at was looking at the Earth, appreciating the Earth in its beauty, and we have evidence that they came back and actually got interested in environmental things, at least according to what they told us in the survey. When you're looking at the Earth from Mars, you see a little dot. No one's in the history of humans has ever studied what it's like to see the Earth as a little dot. None of us have had that experience. We call it the Earth out of view phenomenon. We don't know what will happen. How isolated and lonely might one feel with that perception? I think to enhance the positive experiences, if a positive experience is looking at the Earth and you can't see the Earth from Mars because it's a dot, you're taking away an important support mechanism. So how do we deal with that extreme isolation and loneliness due to the distance? I think that's the third factor in making the life of the astronaut not only avoiding problems, but enhancing the positive experience.
Okay, thank you. To pursue that line of questioning just a bit, and then when we finish the questions here, we'll open it up to the audience for any further questions. On the behavioral health and the support issues, an item that comes up in discussion is the family issues at home on the ground. For a 3-year mission, that's a long time away from the family. What are your thoughts about how to inform the crew and how to handle those issues if there's a family problem back on Earth? Nick, do you want to start with you?
Well, I mean, it's hard because you can't do it in real time, and I think protocols have to be developed where crews can talk to family with built-in delays. In other words, there has to be a protocol where the family and the crew get their questions out, organize what they're going to ask it, go out and do something else, come back and get the response back. So I think it's just a matter of being aware of the time delay and figuring it out. I think the more family support, the better. But this factor of time and delays in communication will have to be built in.
Right now, the way they have it set up is it's a crew preference. They decide before the mission when or if they would be informed about a series of events, including close family member deaths or relatives, even their dog or cat. And some are very adamant about knowing nothing, and others want to know everything and as soon as possible. And there have been times in space where the death of a family member had some psychological sequelae. So a big part of that is crew preference and also discussion with the family.
In Russian practice, we had faced some situations of some negative news from the family, and it would have a significant impact for a time. The program of that flight. It is an important circumstance. And I think, however, then when we select the crew, we need to proceed first and foremost from the motivation of the crew members, their level of professionalism, because this is a unique expedition if and when it takes place, and so for that we need special selection by psychological criteria, by people who are really resistant to stress. And the stress may occur not only in the form of some family problems. The stress is going to be part of that flight. It is going to be there throughout, because the question of safety, the question of risks for a normal, healthy person induces certain tension and psychological response mechanisms. And in the Russian practice, there has been a case of stress due to one's own wrong actions in the crew, and it resulted in a pronounced somatic problem that was accompanied by such changes in the health status that it required taking the crew member out of the crew. So the stress in flight may not only be related to the family's circumstances, is what I'm trying to say. I would like to bring that up for your attention. And from my standpoint, even though I'm not a psychologist, but I think that the degree of a person's professionalism, the degree of his motivation, the reason for his motivation, the proper crew selection may counteract these problems, should counteract these problems. And so in order to resolve psychological problems, I think as one of the main objectives, we have this as one of the key priorities for our 500 days experiment, simulating the flight to Mars, where even before that we had the lengthy experiments of that nature, and there were a number of psychological issues did show up, and they were very similar to what could actually occur in real flight. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess I feel like we will have to come up with some idea of how we would handle that situation. Also the opposite is true. We might lose a crew member on orbit. We've got to deal with that too, and what would happen among the crew as well. I think the one thing that, in terms of communicating back with the family, I think it is going to be extremely difficult the further away from the planet we get. We are very lucky right now, I think, to be able to maintain the level of communication with our families and friends that we do now, and it's not going to be possible when we go farther away. So I think the support that you would anticipate getting from family and friends is going to be much less, and it's going to have to be within the crew themselves that they provide that support.
We've already experienced, long duration exploration using ship. In those days, the crew member left their family for many years, so we have to learn about those things from old days.
Okay, thank you. Let me switch gears just for a moment then. The two top issues brought up so far were about radiation and behavioral health. And looking at the radiation issue, the previous panel with the crew, Dr. Kerwin mentioned that if he knew there were going to be an excess radiation dose, he would go ahead and go. From the medical perspective, if we know we're going to exceed a standard for spaceflight, is informed consent an appropriate way to handle that? And if the answer is yes, what would be the limits of that consent that you would anticipate?
The answer is yes. I actually have concerns about the fact that right now we're living up to some OSHA standards that rely on a lot of theoretical limits that we predict. that are not based too much on evidence, because we just haven't had that much experience with galactic cosmic radiation, so we don't have real evidence-based ways to do this. We're basing it on theory. So I think we are going to have to throw out OSHA standards and do something different, and that is going to involve some just informed consent. There is going to be more risk. We know it. We should just have to accept it. How much, I'm not sure, but we have to just accept the fact if we're going to explore, we're going to have to accept a higher level of radiation.
Well, this is a great question, and the whole area of risk is something that I think is being very actively addressed by the various space agencies, and trying to model risk and the consequences for acute and chronic health concerns and mission performance is an area that we really have a lot of uncertainty about. And so we can do ground-based studies with simulated radiation fields and try to get a better handle on it. But I think Peggy's right. I think ultimately it's a matter of those that are going to incur that risk have to make that decision on their own, and it relates with the families, their reproductive concerns, their long-term health strategies, perhaps family history and genetic predisposition. But ultimately, they're going to have to be the ones that make that call.
Can we ask the question? Sure. And this is, Peggy hit the nail on the head. As a crew member, the answer is yes. Always. I don't care what anybody says. From the medical perspective, what do we have to do to convince you that it's okay, that you can sleep and you don't have to feel guilty for the rest of your life because we accepted a risk that turned out to be, it wasn't our day? What would you like, to know from a crew member that would help you deal with that?
I guess as the moderator, I don't have to answer that question, but I'll. No, actually, Charlie, it's a great question. That was actually the second part of this question: is what level of risk is too high? So you can say informed consent. How far out does that take you? Is a 10% additional risk too high? Is it 25%? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think those are the discussions we'll need to have, because we can forecast going to Mars that we will exceed the standards we currently employ for low Earth orbit and probably also for the Moon. So it's a good time to start probably having those discussions. But I'll open it up to the panel members that would like to respond as well. John, you?
Well, to me, an unacceptable level of risk would be a radiation exposure that would result in acute and substantial performance effects, either fatality or cognitive decline, because then the whole point is that you're not going to be able to accomplish the mission. So to me, that's the line in the sand I would draw. If you have a high level of certainty that the radiation would result in acute performance effects and compromise the mission, then it's pointless to go.
I fully agree with this evaluation. We do not have the right to allow the risk that would impair health or would have serious consequences for, not just fatal, but have serious health consequences. As for what is allowable risk and discussing what is acceptable with respect to getting a very high dose, I think that that's not quite a right approach. I think that we need to look into protection from that radiation. Otherwise, Otherwise, it means that we're premature in even thinking about those expeditions.
I think I already answered.
Yeah, everybody knows that the radiation is very hazardous factors. Can I ask questions? Is it possible to research the countermeasure using nutrition or such things? Is there any researcher that answered the question?
That's an active area of research in the free radical scavengers, both nutraceuticals and then medication.
There was better study where physical exercises and nutrition were compared, and the results just recently, it was finished, I think, right now in the European Space Agency, and the results were that that was the very effective physical exercises and non-effective the nutrition countermeasure. That's the overall effect, which we were informed about.
I just, I guess my sense on this whole radiation issue is that it is a solvable problem. Radiation is a serious problem, but it is a solvable problem. And there are technologies at hand that can be brought to bear on this problem. And one of them is being investigated right here in Houston at the University of Houston with very advanced high-temperature superconductors based on magnesium diboride.
Superconducting coolant such as liquid hydrogen, for example, then that even more enhances the solution. So what I'm saying is that there are technologies that need to be looked at right now. This is not a pipe dream. I mean, this is real. And I just sometimes I detect that almost like a resignation of this is a real problem and there's nothing we can do about it, so we might as well just change our standards. We shouldn't do that.
There's a question back here.
Just a comment. I agree partially with Franklin when he said it's a way to deal with the radiation. But I don't know if we will be ready for Mars mission.
Marcelo, would you use the handheld microphone?
Sure, sir. I agree partially with Franklin in the sense that it's one way to deal with the radiation. But I don't know if we will be ready for Mars with the current technology or the investment that we are doing on that. And there's already technical problems with that. Definitely we will not be ready for the moon, for have an artificial magnetic field. So I think the strategy varies depending of moon mission operations and Mars mission operations in terms of what is the best strategy. And also depending on what kind of radiation we encounter in both scenarios is quite different and present different challenges. In another way, maybe it's a little more easier to deal with protons in terms of shielding. It's more complicated, maybe it's difficult to deal with galactic cosmic ray in a transit to Mars. But at the end, from my perspective, it will be a combination of operational procedures, medical countermeasures, and shielding. There is not a magic bullet that will solve all the problem. One will be a combination of measurements that will solve the problem or make the risk acceptable, I think.
Something Dr. Takabono said raised a question in my mind, and that is that our standards aren't fixed. We wouldn't have gone on long voyages if we had OSHA and a number of the other things that we have now. Some of the things are trivial in that respect in terms of developing standards and laws, but culture changes. Culture changes over the times we're talking about. So it's not going to be the same culture that we have 50 years from now when we're really into long-duration space flight that we have now or that we had 100 years ago. Has anyone thought about that aspect of it? How are we changing our perceptions of what we're willing and able to do?
There's a comment back here. Dr. Dunn, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Going a little bit away from psychology and radiation, which seems to be consensus among the panel members being the main problem areas, but it's a space medicine summit, so can I assume that you do not expect any medical problems on tour? And if yes, what is the foreseen elements for providing medical care en route to Mars and back?
Well, Volker, obviously this is a major part of the summit, and I think that it touches on some very important issues. As a military physician who served in combat, one of the things we had to face was not expending resources fruitlessly, and essentially if somebody was expectant, that you weren't going to do anything about it. So it requires a whole different line of thinking about how you continue to support the mission even at the expense of a single crew member. And there may come a time when you say, we're not going to expend any more resources in that endeavor. And that's something that it may be unacceptable for people, in which case maybe they ought not to be doing this. But I think that this requires a sit down with the crew and the policymakers and the experts and discuss some of these really tough issues.
Dr. Bogomolov. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Campos.
I was just going to say that I got interested in psychopharmacology issues, but I think this holds for any pharmacological issues. You know, there are changes in the body in microgravity. This is assuming no artificial gravity, which I think was the intent of your question. I think we know very little about pharmacological effects of medications in space, and I think it's important. We know that there's fluid shifts, and we know that there's first bypass changes, and we know that there's changes in the gut in absorption. So I think one of the areas that's understudied is the long-term effects on medications that are given in space physiologically, both in terms of absorption and excretion. And I think more research needs to be done, especially for a 2.5-year mission to Mars and back. What are the effects? How would microgravity affect these changes? And how should meds be delivered? I mean, you want to give a shot in the hip where there's not much blood, or in the shoulder where there's a lot of blood. I mean, things shift, and it affects delivery, absorption, and excretion. And I think that's an understudied area that needs more work.
Dr. Bogomolov?
I would like to say that the flight to Mars and all the medical aspects have been looked at by us before. And Polikov's flight, 430 days, almost covers the duration of a flight. And Mr. Polikov's flight was designed to study the effects and counter-effects of a long-duration flight. As far as the medical problems for long-duration flights, we have a whole bag and a little baggage. That's how we say in Russian. It's a whole myriad of issues we need to look at. We need to make sure that we have sufficient resources of medical support, redundancy of existing environmental control systems. We need to make sure that the life is sustained. Also developing procedures, medical procedures for contingencies, be it technical contingencies when some training devices fail. But the most important, of paramount importance, is to have enough functional reserves for such a complicated flight, not only to ensure that we bring the crew members to Mars and bring them back safely, but to make sure that they can effectively function and operate. So we don't want to have a Martian flight for the sake of an experiment only.
I think on a 3.5-year mission we will have medical issues, but always in medicine, as everything else that we fly on a long-duration mission, we've got to balance out what the risks are and where we can put the mass, the up mass required to do all these things, and and have the capability to actually fix or have an impact on what that medical issue is. And that's going to be a hard trade to make in the future, but I think we are going to have to decide there are some conditions that we won't be able to treat, and just decide there won't be any supplies provided to treat that situation. And then here are the situations and the conditions that we would try to treat, and here's the supplies and the hardware that we need to do that. I think drawing that line of what we would or would not want to treat is not going to be an easy one, but I think it's in some ways going to have to be constrained by how much hardware is required to support or to provide that care. So it's not a trivial question.
Yes, the autonomous medical capability is very important. So that raised my question. Astronaut physician is necessary for the mission? To get the autonomous medicine capability?
I think we've heard several times. That actually was a sub-question I had earlier. Dr. Tachibana is asking questions back down to the other end of the panel. Several speakers have commented this morning about the need for a physician to fly. Why don't we take this as a segue back to that question? Is that the case?
Well, I need to say that the flight physician, he is human also, he can fall sick. So if you don't have any other doctors, a backup doctor, that will be difficult if you have a doctor who is ill and who is not able to help himself. I really agree with the speakers from the previous session when the astronaut said that he'll be really concerned having 8 doctors around him, because too much monitoring. I think to have a doctor on your crew mission is very important. But what is more important is medical education for all the crew members, not just one.
Thank you. I think the comments from Jim Voss earlier also, that one of the consensus points we can get from this panel is that all long-duration Mars future crew members will be physicians. That is an excellent question about how, if we have one or more physicians on the crew, how do they maintain their medical competencies? How do they maintain their skills for the set of problems we decide to protect? John, you want to...
Well, this is an area that we can always go back and look at other analogs. And in my background, we had very well trained non-physicians that could handle a lot of different things. I think because you're crew limited and you're mass limited, you need somebody who can do a myriad of different things, not just a physician. And sometimes some of the worst people are physicians because they want all this stuff. And you might be better off with a person who is trained in emergency medicine or expeditionary medicine in extreme environments, as opposed to somebody who's a hospital-based clinician. So I think you need somebody who's a problem solver, very adaptive and flexible, and can do a myriad of things, including medicine. They could be an engineer, a scientist, a mechanic, a jack of all trades. But maintaining proficiency, again, is going to be geared on what are you guiding that to? Airway management, acute life support, acute trauma management, or common medical maladies.
Anyone else on the panel?
I would like to say, let's go back to this Martian experiment of 500 days. We built in some components related to medical contingencies, and we have a whole program for sustaining the skills, medical skills in particular, for all of those participants of this Martian experiment. I think Peggy is fully aware of this experiment, and she knows that during the flight it's very important to sustain your skills, and you use the medical equipment. And if you have good medical training prior to the flight, it's not difficult to sustain your skills once you've got them. It'll be good to know which skills you have to have for such a flight. Absolutely. But technically, it's feasible to sustain your skills once in flight.
Anyone else? Any comments from the audience on training? Dr. Dahman.
It's more follow-up, Peggy, to what you just said. I fully understand that you have to make a selection which conditions you want to treat and to assign the appropriate resources. How would you as a physician deal with that ethically? Because you're trained in principle to offer all your services, but now you have to make a decision, maybe even pre-flight or in-flight, to say no or impossible.
Number one, I'm not a physician.
How should that be dealt with also pre-flight? And do we have ethical boards that already think about such situations? Because that is something new, at least in our domain of space medicine.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, I think it's a complicated issue because it does mean that we are predetermining, that certain situations we are not going to treat. And that's hard ethically to say that. It's hard to say going in that's okay. But if we're leaving this planet and we expect people to survive on their own, in essence, with just the supplies that we send them off with, we're going to be limited on what care we can provide. So I don't have a good answer for you other than to just reiterate that we have to accept that there will be limitations on our medical care that we can provide.
A question I would have for anybody here who's in our planning for station and shuttle, we do have data to support our guesses. We build medical kits, and can we cite the statistical occurrence of medical events that required stuff that we had in the medical kit? Have we ever had an incident for which we were not prepared or we didn't have equipment?
Actually, I'd like to make a comment about that and let John comment as well. Actually, the more interesting database we've seen in NASA is the medical events that have happened in the active core on the ground, and a tremendous variety of issues that we've dealt with. The intersection of that data, I think, is more telling for long-duration spaceflight in that with a Mars mission, there's now a 3-year window of risk. And John's done a lot of work on that. I'll let him comment on that.
Well, that's a great question. We do have a very extensive database, the longitudinal studies, and we have 82 years of human spaceflight as of the end of 2006, and 2/3 of it's in the Russian hands. So from the standpoint of experience base, we really need to go and look at the Russians' data sets because it's much better populated with real events. There are 3 medical evacuations from space were in the Russian program. We have gone through and taken a medical kit and then put a simulation, a scenario out, and run it and seen what we ran out of. And then as a result of that, supplemented our kits so that at least we could get a 24-hour period of coverage. Things that we'd run out of quickly would be perhaps IV fluids, oxygen, and things like that. So we do, and the space medicine folks here do this periodically. They test it with scenarios. With respect to the Dr. Dahman's question, I mean, there are areas where we have to deal with terminating care. In military triage, in mass casualties where you have more casualties than you have the capabilities to deal with in extreme environments that there are some folks like Christian Otto who've had experience with. And you can use those data sets to help come up with guidelines. But the worst situation you can encounter is that you have a limited resources. You throw all those resources at somebody who doesn't have the capacity to survive, and now you have nothing left for the rest of the folks. And it's kind of like the lifeboat scenario. You've only got so much room and somebody's got to go. And those are tough ethical questions. But believe it or not, there are people out there who've actually thought of them and actually dealt with them.
I don't mean to sound flip as a response, but most of us operate medically under community standards. And it just happens that the community standards in space may not match the community standards in Baylor or University of California, San Francisco medical centers because you have limited resources and you have healthy people giving consent about what can be done going into it. So I think the community standard model is a good ethical way to explain this sort of decision making and that it's probably going to be okay ethically to do this.
Let's see, there's some, I'm going to go around the room because I've been missing this side, so let's go right here.
Thanks, Christian Otto from Ottawa, Canada again. Just a couple of comments. One is I agree with Dr. Clark and Dr. Bogomolov that you know, a well-practiced physician is unlikely to lose their skills quickly. Obviously, there's some training that'll need to be ongoing for things that they're not normally engaged with. But I think if you do take a physician who has a significant clinical base or background, that they'll be able to be well-practiced. The other issue is in terms of what happens when your medical provider gets ill. And in the Antarctic program, in fact, at South Pole, we've had a big problem with this, starting with Dr. Jerry Nielsen, who developed ductal carcinoma of the breast. And I'm sure you're well aware of that. And the following year, the South Pole physician had an acute disc requiring narcotic medication for the entire year and was severely incapacitated. The following year, our medical director, and this is all public knowledge, Dr. Shemensky, developed acute cholelithiasis, and he had to be medevac, the first winter medevac from South Pole. And the story doesn't end there. We did not have a secondary medical provider at the time. So with Dr. Nielsen, complete non-medical experts were administering chemotherapy by real-time telehealth. And with Dr. Shemensky, fortunately, there was a nurse who was a tractor driver, so she helped with the ultrasound and so on. So after those 3 incidents, they instituted a secondary medical provider at the level of a physician assistant. And unfortunately, a 4th year in a row, the physician assistant fractured his ankle and developed a DVT. So,
sounds like they're not reliable.
Yeah, but one of the issues, and yeah, Ellen said we're not screening these individuals well, and that is actually a very important point, because the NSF, these individuals could have been more physically fit than they were, and that's not a slight to them. It's just a sort of facts, and in fact, shortly thereafter, they wanted to increase the physical fitness guidelines, much more stringent for the medical practitioners, and they extended that to the station managers. That being said, obviously, you know, we'll have to have some kind of secondary provider. At what level remains to be determined.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Dolchowski in the back.
Hi, Scott Dolchowski from Henry Ford and the NSBRI. You know, I'm a surgeon, and many of you don't want to hear this, but every time I operate on you, it is for the first time, because there's such a variability in your anatomy and how you respond to things. So I think we have to change a little bit about how we think about medical care on this. And while I understand it would be wonderful to have a very versatile physician on board, that would help, I was lucky enough to work with a number of non-physician astronaut crew members on station on complex medical problems. And with virtually no training, Peggy was able to get a diagnostic quality ultrasound image that I could use. We had Russian fighter pilots, geophysicists, perform with very limited training. And so I think we have to think more about a MacGyverism approach to things, because these are going to be very versatile individuals up there. So I think we need to provide the entire crew with modest, complex, interchangeable medical skills. And then I would disagree that telemedicine is not completely appropriate, because I think the majority of things we'll be able to take care of it with a simple computer-based algorithm. And then there's going to be stuff that maybe we didn't anticipate or responds differently. And on those, I would suggest this is how we're going to talk to our crew. So you go, boy, I have this and this and this, and you send it off to the very smart people down here on the planet, and they go, wow, stand by. And then they get back with them with a plan. And there will be a not real-time dependent medical care, but I think that we will have some interaction with them to help them along the way. And so I think the 90% rule that we use in the hospital will be very effective for medical care.
Thanks. There was a comment up front here. If there's no, right here. Sorry.
We discussed the idea of not spending too much resources for the flight, but as for me, as a psychologist and medical person, I think that the main resources are people, the crew. Since the crew is the main resource, I cannot foresee the situation when the engineer, well-trained, is doing surgery aboard. So as for me, it's easier to teach this person to do engineering, I mean medical person, than doing it vice versa. That's the first statement. Second statement is related to the issue of the amount of data aboard for medical services. I think we have provided the crew with more information than they have now. And since it's an autonomous flight, there must be a huge database, medical database first, aboard, which is available for the crew members to use while in flight. So they can take care about themselves and not rely completely like they're doing now on the mission control and the support from Earth. I think it's crucial to think about and how to create this database, what will be the preferences and priorities in its creation, what kind of information will be used in this prolonged flight. So again, I can't see engineer flying instead of medical doctor. For me, just imagine the same situation here on Earth. Do you allow somebody from the grocery shop to do some surgery on you? So I prefer to say that here in the medical community, we have to insist there must be a medical doctor aboard if we are thinking about autonomous flight. And our, I think, purpose of meeting is to define what kind of facilities and logistics should be provided for this extremely skillful person to keep the main resource of the mission, the crew.
Can I comment on that? I think the issue of autonomy is what you're talking about, and I think it's critical that the thinking is a little different, that the thinking on Mars is to select people who can function under autonomous conditions, to train them to function under autonomous conditions, and then to plan the support to be self-regulating and autonomous. I think a crew to Mars is, yes, they can use telemedicine, they can use resources on Earth, but I think the bottom line is, like Columbus or some other explorer, they're going to have to deal internally with issues that come up. They should have time set aside to self-monitor the crew interactions, the physical health, and the whole idea of that crew is going to be thinking autonomously rather than thinking relating to Earth. It's a different kind of set that affects, I think, the medical care.
Yeah, I think Dr. Kerwin captured that with his one of his comments about this is a new country out there by themselves. They're by them. I want to pose one more question to the panel, and looking forward, and that is, what do you see that will change the practice of space medicine in the next 20 years if you consider current areas of research such as in nanohealth and nanotechnology and others? What do you see that would significantly change our practice and perhaps give us more capability than we have today?
Well, at the risk of going out of my area of expertise, I would think that the area of genomics and targeted countermeasures and therapeutics is going to be the biggest advance that we have.
I believe by the time when we'll start implementing the flights to Mars, the technologies, including the medical technology, at least I'm very hopeful that will be more advanced, will be more perfect than we have today. It's really difficult for me to foresee what kind of technology we will be using, whether it will be really advanced nanotechnology or more advanced monitoring technology. But even during the ISS operations, the procedures for selection of the crew members and the medical support procedures have significantly advanced. And we couldn't even foresee how much advanced we'll have those procedures. But by uniting our efforts, we were able to find more advanced methods. We have more standard, international standards for crew selection, and that's a big advancement for us. And there are some aspects that we didn't even think about before, such as MRI of your brain. We are able to find out small developments in your brain prior to the flight. And before, we couldn't even dream that we'll have this MRI technology. Therefore, it's difficult for me statistically to tell exactly what kind of new technologies we'll have available to us in 20 years or more.
let me throw it open to the audience too, because I know there's some opinions about this. Dr. Poole.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to look at the changes in the way we approach this over time. When I joined NASA, the biggest problem we had was to fund the development of medical technologies so we could do things like get a simple EKG on the spacecraft. There was no real ground-based capability to do what we needed to do. And I look at the situation now and I see the very robust development of medical technologies which are going to be very useful, I think, in future space flights. So strategically, instead of funding a great deal of medical development and trying to get into the process very early, would it be strategically better to wait as a medical community, know what you want to do, but wait to select the capabilities that you're going to fly until late in the process of developing the spacecraft? It's a radical departure from what we've done in the past.
Say, Dr. Longnecker.
I'd make just one comment about that. We focused a bit on specific areas like brain imaging and genomics and what have you. But I think one of the greatest potentials for us over the next 20 years is the broadly expanding field of biomarkers of disease, whatever they might be. And we see those now, for example, prostate-specific antigen would be an example, perhaps, with prostate cancer. And in rare diseases, neuromyelitis optica, that we now have IgG markers for it, etc. So from common to rare, there are a developing field of biomarkers that I think offer a great potential, not the only one, but a great potential for either screening, for preventive therapy, for countermeasures, or for diagnosis that we haven't really had much opportunity to explore yet at this time.
Thank you. Dr. Schneider.
I would add another area, and that is to down-tech the diagnostic and treatment abilities. I think that one of the things that NASA can do that would be helpful, or the international community could do, that would be helpful not only for astronauts and cosmonauts in space, but also for people down here on Earth who don't have the tertiary care systems that we have, for example, in the U.S., is to be able to take things that we could take along in space flight and make sure that we evaluate them in terms of the gold standards. And the example of this is actually Dr. Dolchowski's look at the ultrasound device, and to be able to use that as a diagnostic imaging device in those areas where the MRI or the CT is actually the gold standard, and to be able to get good data from that. And the only way to be able to do that is actually to test this.
Let's see, comment back here.
In previous settings, Dr. Clark has talked to the importance of performance, and he mentioned at this meeting. And Jeff has also talked about fitness for duty, and I think these are really critical issues. And in the context of Dr. Longnecker's issue on biomarkers, in the exercise physiology field, there is an evolving database that now suggests that there are clusters of individuals in terms of their ability to adapt to different types of loading stimuli, resistance training. And there are individuals that are very robust in their adaptive capabilities. There are individuals that are, yes, they respond to a certain degree, and there are non-responders. And what is coming out of this research is that there are also biomarkers that coincide to this adaptive potential. And one of the unique features of this research, which is recently reported by a group from the University of Alabama in Birmingham, is that you only need 2 to 3 exercise sessions in order to predict who might fall into these categories. And I think these are powerful tools that the space agencies can take advantage of without spending 12 weeks in bed to predict who might be susceptible or adaptable. So I think we've got to look at some of these evolving technologies. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that comment. And we're out of time for this panel, but I do want to recap just very quickly some of the issues we wanted to touch on going beyond the events we've seen in space had to do with some of the tough ethical issues and limitations of capabilities we'll have going forward, as well as the use of genomics and biomarkers as to the limits of being able to predict performance in a particular area versus being too prescriptive and losing crew members because we screen or test too much. So I think we just started that conversation this morning in all 3 of the panels. You can see what a lot of the forward issues are going to be is the intersection of our ability to detect and predict versus provide care in flight. And I want to thank the panel members this morning. Really, this is just to get the conversation started about some of these tougher areas, and I'm sure much more will emerge about this over the future. So thanks to the panel, and thank you for your attention.